Hi there, this is a tutorial on using decorators in Python. So we're going to start from the beginning. Most people know how to write a function. Let's start there. Call it func, because everyone likes a little funk in their life. And we'll just say groovy. And if we run that, perfect. Great, so now let's try to pass this function into another function. This is going to be the basis for how decorators work. So let's make a new function called bar. And bar is going to take a function as a parameter. Now inside bar, we're going to call that function. And let's just return the result of that for fun. And now down here, we'll call bar, and we can rerun this. So we see bar takes a func, we're going to pass func, and we get groovy. Perfect. Now, building it from here, one thing we might want to do is put a little logic before the function runs within bar and after the function runs within bar. And this is kind of one of the building blocks for how decorators work later on. But let's just start with maybe just doing some timing. So let's go to the top here and import time. And within our function bar, we'll just put time.time as t0. And we'll measure the total time it takes to run this function by calling it. And then afterwards, we'll print out the total time it takes. So now we can do time.time minus t0, and then we'll return the result here. Now, if this all works, let's call bar at the bottom here, passing in func again. Perfect. So we got our output of groovy and the total time in milliseconds that it took to run. So if we want to reuse this, first let's rename bar to timer, because that's a little more obvious of what it's doing. And instead of just calling the function directly, let's make a new function within timer. And we'll just call it wrapper. And that'll become more obvious why we use that name later, but the name doesn't really matter. And we're going to put all this logic in that inner function called wrapper. And we're going to return wrapper at the bottom. Now, this is a bit interesting because what's going to happen here is instead of the function we pass and getting called right away, we get past this intermediate function, which is wrapping it. Wrapping because it's kind of going around the function, if you will, visually as well as logically. And when we get that function back, now we can call it when we want to. So this way we're able to add some extra logic to our function without immediately calling it. So now when we have timer func, let's see what happens. Well, nothing happens. And the reason there's nothing happening is because now it's not calling this function. So let's get the return value here and maybe call it timed func. And then let's print what time func is. And you can see that it is itself a function, which makes sense because it's the return of this, which is this wrapper function. So now let's actually call this timed func and see what we get. Perfect. So we got the output of our func function, groovy, and the total time it took, and the function name here that we printed out as we got before. So that's super useful because now we can add a little bit of functionality, like I said, to any function we give this timer function, and then we later on can call that. Now you might imagine if you have a lot of existing code and you want to add some timing wrapping later, this could get very tedious because you'd have to go in and override all your existing functions. Now the way to get around that is with decorators, because this little setup here where we pass a function in, wrap it in this inner function, and return the inner function without calling it is the basis for how decorators work in Python. The decorator syntax, which you might be familiar with, is this @ syntax, is actually just syntactic sugar for doing this assignment operation here, where we assign a new function to the wrapped value of our initial function. Now, let's see what that looks like in practice. So instead of doing what we just did, let's take func, and we're going to put it down here. I'll clean this up. Now, let's just see what func is normally and make sure that everything's working as we expect. So if we just call func, obviously, it'll just print without this timing because we're just calling the original raw function. Perfect. But now let's use the built-in decorator syntax that Python gives us and put @timer here. Now, like I said, this @timer is the same as if we had done timed func equals timer func. Now, can't spell func. Now, Python's just doing this behind the scenes when we add this @ syntax here. So let's see what happens now when we call func. Boom. So we get the output and we get the time. That's excellent. Now you can see how powerful this is because now, without doing anything in terms of renaming our function, we can take this timer decorator and just add it after the fact where we need it in our code. We don't have to go in our code and redefine a bunch of functions as timed func equals timer passed in the value of the function, because we can just sprinkle in these little decorators on top. And that's kind of why they're called decorators, is because you can just add them as little toppings to your functions that already exist. So this is super handy, and how decorators work in Python. So hopefully that was useful. And if you like the video and want to see more, I'm going to plan to do some more advanced tutorials on decorators in Python, because from here there's a lot more we can do. We can pass values into our decorators. We can do all sorts of fancy things with decorators as classes and various other things. So hopefully this was useful, and have a great day. Thanks.